Society builders paved the way to a better world, to a better day. A united approach to building a new society. Join a conversation for social transformation. Society builders. Woo.
Society Builders with your host, Duane. Welcome to another exciting episode of Society Builders, and thanks for joining the conversation for social transformation. We interrupt our normal sequence of episodes today for a special episode. It's not so much of an interruption, it's more of a special treat. As avid listeners will know, we're in the middle of our sequence of episodes exploring social action. We just completed 4 episodes exploring what social action looks like from a Baha'i perspective. And we're gearing up for a sequence of case studies highlighting what social action looks like in practice. And we were already planning on a special treat coming in the middle of the sequence anyway with this year's Rezvan message. But now we have an additional special treat because on March 19th, the Universal House of Justice gave us an incredible treasure to the Baha'i world, a message focusing on the theme of Baha'i family life. And I believe it has a very particular application, which we're going to explore in today's episode. And we get additional insight here from yet another message, the Naw Ruz message of the Universal House of Justice to the Baha'is of Iran, which further expands on this March 19th message on family life. So we have a lot of divine guidance that we can learn from here. So stop the presses. We interrupt your normally scheduled program for a special episode where we can explore these latest messages from the Universal House of Justice. So today, we will be exploring the role of the Bahá'í Home in our larger society building narrative. Now, the March 19th and the Naw Ruz messages are incredibly profound. They have incredible nuance to them that's easy to miss, particularly when you read them thinking you already know what they're about. I think it's easy to give these messages a quick read and walk away thinking that these are just nice letters reminding us about how important Baha'i family life is. But I think that kind of reading misses the point. Yes, these messages are about family life, but they represent a very significant advance in how we understand all of this. And that shift is deeply profound. It's something you'll want to consult extensively about in your marriage, in your family, in your groupings, and in your communities. It's not a summary of what our writings say about Baha'i family life. There are other spaces for that, including the compilation on family life and a few statements by the Baha'i International Community, for example. But this, I think, is something very different. These are messages which help situate the Baha'i home within the larger narrative of society building. And that, I think, is a particularly unique contribution within these messages. And once you read and try to understand these messages, it will change the way you understand society building. In fact, in some ways, I think it adds another dimension to society building. Now, I'm not going to be able to do these letters justice with a short podcast like this, so my goal is not to give you a summary. Instead, I want to draw your attention to a number of key concepts, which I hope will help you in your own reflecting, deepening, and consultations on this. And I promise we will eventually do a whole sequence of episodes on this theme of the Baha'i home, because there's just so much ground to cover. So today, I'll simply highlight a number of key concepts, drawing your attention to some of the features that stood out to me in these messages. And I want to clarify that I'll primarily be focusing on the March 19th message, looking to the Naw Ruz message to the Baha'is of Iran for some additional clarification related back to the March 19th message. Because in the Naw Ruz message, the Universal House of Justice itself makes reference to the March 19th message, encouraging the Baha'is in Iran to study it while highlighting some additional themes. Now, one more thing before we get to our main story here. In these messages, I think, the Universal House of Justice is doing three things. First, there are parts of the message that remind us of our existing writings on Baha'i family life. So here, the Universal House of Justice is doing some curation, helping us better understand our writings, for example. Then, there are also parts in these messages where they extend these writings, helping us see some of the implications that we might not have previously noticed, or helping apply this to new situations. And then finally, and this is the best, finally, there are parts where they introduce new ideas and new constructs altogether. And all three of these different kinds of applications are truly gifts, gifts that help us look to family life and to society building in entirely new ways. But from time to time today, I'll try to clarify which of these three different types of gifts are at work, particularly when it appears that the Universal House of Justice is covering new ground. So that's something else to keep in mind in today's little journey. So what is the March 19th message really about? Again, you'll want to draw your own conclusions, but to me, the key to understanding the larger objectives of that message is articulated in both the very beginning and towards the end of the message. So we can look to the bookends of the message, so to speak, to understand its main objectives. The introduction ends with what I think is a summary of this goal. They say, learning about a new pattern of family life is therefore an integral part of the effort to learn about the release of the society-building power of the faith. So there are two key constructs here that should immediately grab our attention. First, that this is about new patterns of family life. That word new is very telling. It means we shouldn't assume that we already understand what they are. So this is your first big clue that you shouldn't read this thinking you already know what it's all about. But it's about new patterns. So let's look to the message to help get some clues about these new patterns. And the second important idea here is that it's an integral part of the release of the society-building power of the faith. And that's really, I think, the overarching goal here with this message, that we grapple with how the Baha'i home fits in with our larger society-building aspirations. And this represents a significant advance in how we understand society building. So in that context, this is a very, very important message. So it turns out it's not, I think, a message about Baha'i family life, as we might have initially assumed. It's a message of the role of the Baha'i home in the larger process of society building. I mean, it sounds similar, but it's actually quite different. And I think this becomes even more evident as the message builds to its conclusion towards the end of the message, which further clarifies this focus. Towards the end, we see the Universal House of Justice talking about the forces of disintegration that are assailing families, an inseparable feature of this age of transition. And as we respond by releasing the society-building powers of the faith, they say that the part played by Baha'i families will be increasingly necessary and impactful in the years and decades ahead. Now, there's a part of me that was truly terrified when I read this. Again, it's hard to know what our future has in store for us, but clearly it's painful and dark. And in this social milieu, you have to wonder what the role of family is, because it's clear from this message that family will be both necessary and impactful in navigating the storms. The messages of the Universal House of Justice are truly precious gifts to us, a special bounty. And one of the reasons for this is that it gives us our best way of understanding the conditions in the world around us. And across these two messages, we have descriptions that paint this very dark picture. The Naw Ruz message to the Baha'is in Iran, for example, talks about this time when the earth is caught in the grip of chaos, confusion, and instability. and its political, economic, and social order is ever more volatile and out of control. When the peoples of the world are seized by various ordeals and hardships and are struggling against incurable ills, when despair and hopelessness and a lack of confidence about the future and the erosion of the bonds of trust have led to a widespread crisis, particularly among many young people in the world. The March 19th message also addresses this dark condition. They describe it as the forces of disintegration that are an inseparable feature of an age in transition. These forces assailing society have particularly affected the family, sundering its ties and taking a heavy toll on its members, especially on children. They can expose family members to some of the most destructive social pathologies: an absence of love and care, neglect of the things of the spirit, dehumanization, poverty, insecurity, and violence. Individuals are tempted to surrender to a life of material distractions or personal gratification, thereby becoming mere objects to be manipulated by those who seek to impose their designs on society. Contrasting ideologies and identities incompatible with the ideals of the oneness of humanity and a peaceful world vie for the allegiance of the masses and contend for superiority with one another. Some of these movements plant seeds of prejudice and fanaticism, which ultimately yield estrangement, conflict, and contention among the peoples of the world. Others may seem to conform to some aspect of the teachings, only to subtly lead the friends away from Baha'u'llah's straight path. Wow. This is very, very dark, right? And I know you feel this. And this dark condition is the reason why we so desperately need this guidance. They say the family and the community as a whole will need to learn to examine existing circumstances, grasp the nature and impact of such forces, and with full reliance on divine assistance, develop preventive and remedial measures in order to weather the tumultuous storms of a perilous age. So, we need to read our social reality free from the noise we hear all around us, and with full reliance on divine assistance, we need to develop both preventative and remedial measures to weather these storms. Now, let's start with this appeal for us to examine existing circumstances and grasp the nature and impact of such forces. Well, this is something all of us are going to have to do in consultations with our families and communities. You can literally work your way through the list of these conditions that the Universal House of Justice identifies here in the message and ask yourself, how does this speak to your conditions? For example, the Universal House of Justice says, individuals are tempted to surrender to a life of material distractions or personal gratification, thereby becoming mere objects to be manipulated by those who seek to impose their designs on society. So, this raises a question. How are you being manipulated in this way? And I'll give you just one little example here. There's an interesting case that's made the news recently where a former senior executive at Facebook claims that they would target young girls when they exhibited signals of personal insecurity. So on occasions with these girls, for example, they would take down images of themselves on Facebook, probably because they didn't feel particularly pretty that day or reflecting some kind of insecurity at the time. And Facebook would then use that as a signal, the signal of them removing their images to indicate that this was a target suffering from this kind of personal insecurity. And that condition would make them particularly receptive to ads from cosmetic advertisers. And then they would sell that particular audience segment to those advertisers, essentially preying on these young girls' vulnerabilities. And this is just a mild example of the kind of manipulation that is increasingly becoming the norm. I mean, remember in our discussion on depolarization in that previous episode, where we talked about the role that Facebook played in the ethnic cleansing that unfolded in Myanmar? There are plenty of these kind of horrific stories that you read about every day about how we're increasingly being manipulated in these ways. So what the Universal House of Justice is calling us to do here is to not drink the Kool-Aid, to stop and reflect, open our eyes, and see all these nefarious forces at work in our own lives, to become aware of these forces, because becoming aware is step one here. Then they call on us to develop preventive and remedial measures to weather these forces. Preventive and remedial. Preventive to help reduce the influence this cancer is having on our family life. Remedial to heal the damage that is done. That's a lot to reflect on, right? And note that they don't even say that we can achieve this all with our own faculties. Like we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking we're smart enough to resolve this all on our own. The challenge is so great that we need to rely on the power of divine assistance. I mean, that says a lot, right? And in the Naw Ruz message to the Baha'is in Iran, they expand further on this process of reflection so that we not only protect the institution of the family from the darts of destruction, but make it a space for acquiring perfections and a haven from harm, ultimately turning it into a constructive and potent instrument for social transformation. Wow. So hopefully this really gets your attention. It explains the urgency of our circumstances. So what new patterns can we weave that will empower us to both prevent and remedy these horrible social ills? That, my friends, is the focus, I think, of this message. Now, towards the beginning of the message, the Universal House of Justice explores this idea of patterns. They remind us how Abdu'l-Baha explained that the family is a microcosm of larger society. He says, a family is a nation in miniature. The conditions surrounding the family surround the nation. How our skills and abilities to interact with others are shaped first in the family, and how we take these patterns to our friendships, our workplace, and ultimately to the fabric of our entire nation. Now, this is that curation role I was talking about earlier. They're reminding us of our teachings. They're giving us a guided tour, for example, of what Abdu'l-Baha has already taught us about these patterns. But then they introduce a new concept. And this is the idea that family, as a construct, is inherently dynamic. That it's changing, that it's ever changing. Now, this is fascinating. I may be mistaken in asserting this, but I can't think of any of our writings that frame family quite this way. I mean, it's a logical extension, but I think it's still a new way of framing it for us. And this is really important to our narrative here, because we probably all think that we already know a lot about what our teachings are on family. So this is key to helping us wake up and smell the coffee and realize that, whoa, we evolve. And the institution of family evolves too. This is fascinating, right? They explain how expectations of parents change, how our kinship allegiances change, and how gender roles change. And these, of course, are just examples. So this requires us to reevaluate the thoughts and theories of past ages. Just a little side note here. I'm a baby boomer, and most of our baby boomer mothers raised us on guidance they received from a book written by Dr. Benjamin Spock called Baby and Child Care. I know this was the book that my mother used when she was raising me. So I think it's hilarious that Dr. Spock came out some years ago to confess that he thinks he got it all wrong. That probably explains a lot about me. So clearly there's a need for change, right? I mean, even Dr. Spock says he got it all wrong. Anyway, back to our story. What the Universal House of Justice is drawing our attention to is that conditions change, societies change, and the patterns of family change in response. And that's not inherently a bad thing. They have to respond to the exigencies of the various stages of human social development. But here's the catch. How are those changes? How are those new patterns emerging? And herein is our challenge to examine the present practices in their society, weigh them in light of the teachings, weed out any undesirable tendencies, and learn to establish new patterns of family life suited to the needs of a new age. Now, at this stage, you're probably thinking, okay, I'm sold. So tell me what that new pattern looks like. Aha! I caught you, because we don't know what it looks like yet. We're still too nascent. There are different conditions across different societies, so it's not about adhering to one specific formula. It's like everything else society building. We have to engage in a learning process, and it's a learning process that will accelerate greatly in the coming years as we grow in capacity and work to apply our teachings. And they raise a series of questions for us to consider as we engage in this kind of learning process, like what are the characteristics of Baha'i family and how are they distinguished from the way family life is understood in society today? What is the distinctive nature of Baha'i marriage and how does it foster family life? How do Baha'i families contribute to the process of transformation in neighborhoods and villages and beyond? What are the current pitfalls and obstacles facing Baha'i families that prevent them from achieving this aim? How does the framework for action of the current stage of the Divine Plan both strengthen family life and create opportunities for vibrant families to contribute to the process of community building? And by the way, later in this message, they explore what this kind of reflection and learning looks like. And they describe it in very similar terms to what we discussed recently in that episode where we discussed action learning. Here they talk about prayer, study, consultation, and reflection on action. So you can see that there's a lot there for us to explore. And as we explore, we will increasingly see these new patterns evolve in our family lives. So as families, let's roll up our sleeves and discover. Now, it shouldn't be surprising that if we're going to explore family, inherently that exploration is going to start with marriage, the starting point, so to speak, of all of this, the inscrutable instrument for the fulfillment of our destiny, as Baha'u'llah says. So here again, we see a curation of many of our writings on marriage, how marriage is a partnership of both mind and heart, how it helps us improve the spiritual life of each other, and how we can become even as one soul. And this is key as we work towards both developing our potentialities and contributing to an ever-advancing civilization, and how this union affects the forging of countless new relationships with others, helping to reshape lives and communities. Then you see clear criticism by the Universal House of Justice of many of the social practices that are evolving around marriage, that are evolving around us. And there are some very specific practices that they seem to be highlighting here. But in my own simple way of understanding all of this, I think what they're reminding us here is that the concepts of marriage that pervade in the world around us are warped, and that we need to cling to our teachings to navigate the perversity of our age. And throughout this message, and in a section on marriage, they raise the importance of full equality between men and women, again reminding us of how this cultivates patterns including how we raise our children that ultimately shape society. But they clarify that equality doesn't mean that a husband and wife are doing the same thing. That as a starting point, mothers are the first educators of the child, fathers have an obligation to support the family financially. But the point here is that based on their understandings of the teachings, the couple together determine the best way to manage their affairs in light of the challenges and opportunities they face. But in doing so, they need to ensure both the wife and husband's spiritual, intellectual, and professional progress. Now, the Universal House of Justice then ladders us up from marriage to family, identifying two key principles that should govern our affairs as families: justice and reciprocity. Justice and reciprocity. So that's another one of those things you want to reflect on. How do these two principles speak to your pattern of family life? Does each member of the family receive their rights? Does each fulfill their responsibilities? And this is something we have to actively cultivate. And our challenge here is to raise children so that they learn to live a meaningful and purposeful life of devotion, virtue, and service. And parents do this both through loving conversations and through their example. Now, here again, they go beyond the existing writings. Again, they highlight how dynamic this process is, highlighting how parents have to adapt their methods and approaches across every stage of development, from infancy to maturity. At an early age, they cultivate virtues and learn to turn to God. But as they get older, they learn how to address hardship, practice self-discipline and accountability, and learn to become forgetful of self. And they study. And as they increasingly step into the world on their own, they learn to develop an attitude of service, to diffuse and apply the divine teachings, to resolve differences and participate in consultation, to remain steadfast in the covenant, to work for the betterment of the world, and to direct themselves to those things that lead to everlasting honor. And the Universal House of Justice encourages us here to use both the writings and other resources in our quest to provide for the material, social, and spiritual needs of our children. And they also explain how the financial affairs of the family need attention, including how money is earned, spent, and saved. I'm reminded here of their message of March 1st, 2017, where they address economic issues with that amazing quote. They say, "Every choice a Baha'i makes as employee or employer, producer or consumer, borrower or lender, benefactor or beneficiary, leaves a trace. And the moral duty to lead a coherent life demands that one's economic decisions be in accordance with lofty ideals, that the purity of one's aims be matched by the purity of one's actions to fulfill those aims." And here the Universal House of Justice is applying a similar principle in managing the financial affairs of the family, highlighting how the family provides a space to learn in practice about generosity, responsibility, the difference between needs and wants, and the management of material means. Again, you see how these are patterns we take on ultimately to our interaction with society. Okay, now for another one of those unique gifts in the message, another new insight, I think. Now, let me digress before I discuss this next section and share a little story with you. My wife and I were once on a summer school committee, and as we were planning, we suggested that the theme that year should be on parenting. And in response to this, one of the committee members, a member who already had grown children, said, "I think that's a terrible idea. All I'm going to learn is what I did wrong." Now, I think that's hilarious, but it raises a good point. I can see how there might be people who see this message and think, it's not really meant for me. I don't have kids, or Maybe I'm not married, or maybe my kids are all grown up already. Okay, so stop right there. That's what's so exciting about this next section, because the Universal House of Justice next widens the circle yet again, like a telescope. And this time, they explore family from a different angle, bringing in the role of extended family and friends. So they start with the immediate nuclear family, siblings, and they grow to extended family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, all with guidance on their roles. But then they go further, exploring how these relationships extend to fellow Baha'is and other friends. And one of the things that really put an immediate smile on my face was a reference that they make here to spiritual aunts and uncles. How delicious is that? Now, in layman terms, we talk about spiritual aunts and uncles all the time, but here the Universal House of Justice is referencing it. I mean, it's now official. Officially now, we have a construct of spiritual aunts and uncles. Again, this is another example of a new construct, I think, that they're introducing. So suddenly, everyone is connected to family in some way. Elders, youth, everyone. So for every family, there are suddenly a whole host of links, a whole host of new support mechanisms. And the Universal House of Justice describes how the sense of oneness, of love, care, trust, and solidarity that are initially cultivated in the family begin to be woven into the fabric of relationships in the community. And then the Universal House of Justice widens the circle yet again, this time to the dynamic interaction of family with wider society. And they draw once again on how the coherence we cultivate between our beliefs and actions impacts society, how our belief in the equality of women and men, for example, our adherence to the principle of the oneness of humanity, how these cultivate relationships of unity and oneness in a divided world. We become bridges. And in so many other ways, in the skills we bring for consultation, in upholding qualities such as justice and compassion. And so here we're applying these new patterns as we learn to apply our teachings in our own family life. It creates patterns that extend to the world we encounter. And it's in this context, this widening of the circle to wider society, that the Universal House of Justice introduces a new construct or a new institution, the Bahá'í Home. And I think this is a really big deal. You can read this casually and think, oh yeah, the Bahá'í Home. But I think that the Universal House of Justice here is actually introducing a new construct, a new institution, like the way they introduced the concept of cluster or neighborhood. Those terms have their own meaning on their own, but they take on a different meaning in the context of our plans. They become part of a new shared language with the whole system of meaning behind them. So it's not that family is new, but the way we're now talking about it is new. And we know that this reference to the Bahá'í Home is a reference to it as an institution because the Universal House of Justice tells us so in its Naw Ruz message. In that message, they encourage the friends to reflect on the influence of the divine teachings on the progress of the family as an institution and the significant consequences that such progress has for the advancement and upliftment of society. So fasten your seatbelts, because increasingly we're going to be framing this new institution in our formal planning, the Bahá'í Home. And trust me, we're going to be learning a lot about this in the immediate years ahead. And they say, in a Bahá'í home, warm hospitality combines with spiritual quickening and intellectual progress. So we have 3 aspirations here for our Bahá'í homes: hospitality, spiritual quickening, and intellectual progress. and they summon us here. Through activities that every Baha'i family can offer in its home, it can demonstrate a way of life that can be emulated by all those who seek to counteract the divisive forces that feed discontent, conflict, and self-interest, and to weave the bonds of trust, cooperation, and constructive action upon which a healthy community depends. So the Baha'i Home is a refuge for a suffering people here, and they explore how this all ties in to the other facets of community life. So we have coherent lives of service, sacrificial service, advancing together in our communities. But they also give us a warning here, a limit. They say, sacrifice makes possible greater service, but it is not the family itself that is to be sacrificed. So we need to maintain due regard for the needs of the family. But make no mistake, in this message, the Universal House of Justice is helping draw our attention to a critical discourse in society, and one which we should actively engage in. And that is this discourse on family. And we know that they're framing it this way because they directly explain it this way in the Naw Ruz message, calling on us to participate in the discourse related to family. And the message concludes with an inspiring quote from Abdu'l-Baha. My home is the home of peace. My home is the home of joy and delight. My home is the home of laughter and exultation. Whosoever enters through the portals of this home must go out with gladsome heart. This is the home of light. Whoever enters here must become illumined. And they close the message with these beautiful words. May your families and homes, dear friends, increasingly become a haven and pillar to sustain all humanity. Wow, these were incredibly inspiring messages that really expand our understanding of the world around us and of the role of family in society building. Now, I want to emphasize here again that this is not just a message that you can read. It's a message you have to study, reflect on, and consult on as families. You'll want to stop, read each sentence, and specifically address all of the questions that they raise throughout, and ask yourself how that speaks to you and your circumstances and opportunities. There's simply no substitute for it. The message is just far too meaty and far too impactful. Remember, you're trying to discover these new patterns in your family life. So gather your family. If you're in a relationship exploring marriage, if you're a couple planning on having kids, if your kids are all grown up and you're exploring how to support other families, in all these ways, this is the perfect opportunity to reflect and see how this speaks to you. And the most exciting part, let's see what amazing new patterns evolve for the Baha'i home in this tumultuous age. So much to learn and discover. So that's it for today. Stick around to hear a song I've written with the help of AI that attempts to summarize all of this. I call the song The Baha'i Home. By the way, you can find a collection of all the songs I'm now writing on a new website, Baha'itunes.org. Or you can search for my new virtual AI band, which I'm calling The Society Builders. Don't forget the in there. But you can search for it, The Society Builders, on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, and the like. I'm also leaving a few links in the episode description, but if nothing else, you can find the music at Baha'itunes.org. And let me know what you think of this song and whether it helps you in summarizing the episode. And our next episode will explore another treasure, the upcoming Rizwan message of the Universal House of Justice. So that's an episode you won't want to miss. So thanks again for joining the conversation on social transformation. I look forward to joining you again in our journey next time. on Society Builders.
Of transition, trying to counter all the disintegration, where families feel assailed from every side, from a society that is so disunified. As we weather the tumultuous storms we see, we need to focus on our promise of unity, because the Bahá'í Home is a haven, you know, where society building can flourish and grow. It's the fabric of community as we build a new society. The Bahá'í Home is a critical key to helping build a new society, creating patterns of trust, love, and service that in a troubled age will help to preserve us, because the home is a nation in miniature. What happens in the nation happens there too. It's the building block of community. That's why we need a new focus on family. Marriage lays a solid foundation. It's a partnership of cooperation, a union of both mind and heart that gives the family a solid start. As families grow, they navigate hardships. Through consultation, we work through conflicts. As we extend our circle ever wider and build a new world that's so much brighter. It's the fabric of community as we build a new society. The Bahá'í Home is a critical key to helping build a new society, creating patterns of trust, love, and service that in a troubled age will help to preserve us, because the home is a nation in miniature. What happens in the nation happens there too. It's the building block of community. That's why we need a new focus on family. A critical key to helping build a new society, creating patterns of trust, love, and service that in a troubled age will help to preserve us, because the home is a nation in miniature. What